Indianapolis, Indiana. 317, Crossroads of America, home of the Indianapolis 500, the place where I was born and raised. And the cool thing about being from Indianapolis is that there are so many other cool people who are from here and got their start here. People like David Letterman, Vivica Fox, Mike Epps, and Mark Summers. And lastly, I'm going to talk about two individuals from Indianapolis as well, Daryl Simmons and Kenny Babyface Evans. If you're like me, I love R&B music. And just about every R&B and pop artist from the mid-'80s and early '90s had a top hit song produced and written by Daryl Simmons and Babyface. I also want to mention L.A. Reid, who is from Cincinnati but lived here in Indianapolis and teamed up with Babyface to form the powerhouse record label LaFace Records, which was located in Atlanta, Georgia. The two also performed in the group The Deal, who had some major hits. But back to Daryl Simmons and Babyface. The two met at North Central High School in Indianapolis, Indiana, same school I went to. Go Panthers! You know what? I'm going to let Sid Johnson tell the story of how it all came about.
Jam with him at a gig that they did, and he did. And when Daryl did that, he kind of was expressing, I think, to Kenny and maybe a couple of people, I sure wish I could be in the band. You know, his good buddy was now in the band, and so they said, well, you need to ask Sid. So when it came there, I said, I'm not in the band, I'm the manager. I need to decide if you want to add another guy. Right. And so,
well, I mean, it's good that they was like always going through you. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, I don't. It causes you to be the one holding the bag, whether it's a good bag or a bad bag. Right. So I said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a meeting in the back room, and Daryl, you wait out here. So I believe in Robert's Rule of Order, and I believe in the pecking order and how I operate business. I said, okay, guys, Daryl wants to join your group. And so we're going to do this the Democratic way. You're going to vote. And so the vote was 5-1 for him to join the group.
Oh, wow.
One person voted against it. Because that person said, I don't want to divide our money 7 ways. Dividing the 6 is enough for me. Yeah. So 5-1, he won. So I went outside and told him to come into the room. And I said, guess what? You're in.
Wow.
So that was on July 4th. 1976, when Daryl joined the band. So that's the history of how all of that happened in the beginning. When Daryl joined the band, we already had a record deal, and we were in the midst of working out the material to get ready to go to Chicago to finish recording the album. Right. So this is when the musical pastors started changing, because with the influence of Daryl and Kenny now writing, the way they wrote and the things they brought to the table were a little bit different than the hard funk edge that Manchild had prior to them joining the group.
Yeah. Wow. Now when because I know, so I know the story of L.A., how he met Kenny, like, because they performed, because it wasn't a lot of places to perform in Cincinnati. They came here and he saw him performing. But then he met him in the studio.
That's not how it happened.
But he said he met him in the studio.
That's not how it happened.
Yeah. How'd they meet?
I am the person that introduced Antonio Reid to Kenny Edmonds.
Really?
At the nightclub called the Zodiac.
Yep, Zodiac. Now the Zodiac, that was on 38th and Emerson?
Correct.
Yes.
And what happened was there was a group called Essence.
Yep.
From Cincinnati, which Essence morphed into being called The Deal.
Yep, The Deal. Yep.
And all of those boys from Cincinnati had moved over to Indianapolis and they hooked up with various chicks in Indianapolis and was shacking up with them. And I took Kenny up to the Zodiac Club to hear Essence play. And I introduced L.A. Reid to Kenny on that night. And Kenny had just formed a new band called April, which had his brother Kevon Edmonds in it, and several other musicians. That's after he left Manchild. And April was getting ready to open up a show for Midnight Star. And on that particular night, I gave L.A. Reid some complimentary tickets to come to that show.
Okay.
That was the introduction to Kenny Edmonds to Antonio Reid, also known as L.A. Reid.
Man, that's monumental. Like you made that connection. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Wow. So when did he end up? Because I heard the story where he was in Cincinnati at some studio, and then that's when they asked him to join the deal. Or was that just
that was later.
Okay.
Kenny, after April disbanded, he then dealt with this group out of Michigan called the Crowd Pleasers. They were a top 40 band. Mm-hmm. And the Crowd Pleasers, Kenny was starting to really develop into some good writing on the 4-track tape recorder at that point in time. And a manager of the deal kept in contact with Kenny, and Kenny always kind of wanted to have an opportunity to break loose.
Yeah.
But L.A. did not feel that Kenny was dweed enough, which is an expression that
when they say, when they breed
enough. So at some point, Kenny, the song Slow Jam, Kenny and I wrote that song, and April did that song first. And then
really?
Midnight Star heard that song when Kenny and April opened the show for them, and I remember playing it over the phone for Bo and Melvin of Midnight Star after we were doing it, when we were, writing it, and they would say, "Oh man, Sid and Kenny wrote this song called Slow Jam, man, it is so bad, blah, blah, blah." So to fast forward things a little bit, after April was no longer in existence, and Kenny was in the Crowd Pleasers, and he came to Cincinnati to the studio to play guitar on the session for Slow Jam for Midnight Star's No Parking on the Dance Floor album. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's where L.A. Reid popped by the studio and heard Kenny in the booth singing the demo of the song.
That's it.
And this is when he said, "Man, that song is bad. Who was that in there singing?" And they said, "Kenny Edmonds." He said, "Kenny Edmonds?" And when Kenny stepped out of the booth, he now was Breed, because now he had he now had a LA curl, and he didn't look like the what did Kenny call, like a college players club jacket, or he didn't look like that same guy that L.A. Reid had remembered.
That's funny.
And so that's
that you knew he was different, like, you know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Like what
I always knew that Kenny was special very early on. I remember in 1980, we were at the Edmonds home in Riviera watching Saturday Night Live on TV, and Aretha Franklin was on there. And Kenny said one day, "I want to produce her and write something for her." And lo and behold, his dream came true.
So there you have it. You know what's interesting, Sid was dropping gems about how collectively Babyface, Daryl Simmons, and L.A. Reid came together as a unit. And it's just crazy to think about that Babyface was dreaming about writing songs for Aretha Franklin, and he ended up doing that down the road, and writing so many other hits for a lot of artists in the music industry. But it's interesting. There were many key players that made that happen. One of them, as we're talking about this documentary today, was L.A. Reid, and I saw this clip that I thought was amazing on Questlove's podcast, where L.A. Reid was talking about when he lived in Indianapolis and how this all came together.
And to get local gigs. Are you localized as in Cincinnati only, or do you have it so that you can go out of state and those types of things?
So we were Cincinnati for the most part, and then Indianapolis, which was 100 miles away.
Okay.
And it was a kind of a strange phenomenon. When we were ready to play in the clubs, music started to change, and this was probably like 77, something like that, 76, 77. Mm-hmm. And Cincinnati was slightly more progressive than like Indianapolis, which was like I said, 100 miles away, and disco was taking over. So there were no gigs in Cincinnati. I mean, we played the clubs in Cincinnati. Like there were like 4 or 5 clubs that we would play weekends. But somebody turned me on to a club called the Zodiac Lounge in Indianapolis. Mm-hmm. This was life-changing. Okay. So I drive to Indianapolis with my band members, go to this club, see the club owner, and they hired us to play 6 nights a week. That didn't happen in Cincinnati. So now we're doing 6 nights a week, 4 shows per night, like 4 45-minute sets per night, 6 nights a week.
Per night, and you're doing 100 miles each way?
No, we literally end up moving there. We got an apartment there. Okay. Like we got the gig, went back, got our gear, came back, stayed in the hotel for a couple of nights, really bad, cheap hotel. Mm-hmm. I forgot what it was called. Maybe it was the Rico 8, something like that, right?
If it's number in it, you're in trouble. There's a number in it.
Yeah, right. It was those. So we got a little apartment, and we ended up staying there for 3 or 4, about 4 years, playing clubs. And it went from one club to the next, and all over the city. And that's where we really kind of learned.
So what was it about that particular environment that was a jackpot moment, as opposed to, you know, the city that we would expect,
right,
this wide open door of music to come from?
The difference was entertainment nightly, right? And so that meant it was no longer a weekend thing. That it wasn't which weekends could be hobby, even though we were serious. That could be deemed hobby. Whereas 6 nights a week, that's your job.
Okay. So you're saying before 77, a Monday night party somewhere wasn't a thing. No. Thursday night party wasn't a thing. Only Friday, Saturdays, and Sundays.
Friday, Saturday for the most part, right? And then there might be an occasional wedding, fashion show, something like that. But for the clubs were only weekends. And we went to Indianapolis, and it was like 7 or 8 clubs that had entertainment every night, and all the bands were competing. And that's when I realized that there was a different caliber of musicians. Like in Cincinnati, everybody was funk. We were all funk musicians, and some people could, maybe jazz influenced, maybe a little blues influenced, but we were all funk. When I went to Indianapolis, which is where Babyface is from, mm-hmm. and Reggie Griffin, you might know Reggie Griffin, and Rayford Griffin, his brother, who's like this incredible fusion drummer, right? And it was an entire community of really, really gifted musicians. I realized then that I wasn't long for drumming, right? They put us to shame. It was insane.
Man, I remember. Yeah, I remember it was good. Back in the day, getting my pen, writing rhymes to instrumentals. North Central, 92, my life changed. Black Moon, who got the props? And you know it don't stop, huh? Yeah, check it. It was back in 92 when I met you. I grabbed my pen, I kept on writing, never left you. Who got the props? It don't stop hip hop.
You know, you can't mention the story of Daryl Simmons, Babyface, and L.A. Reid without mentioning the impact that LaFace Records had on the music industry. Even going back to 1990, when Daryl Simmons and Babyface and L.A. Reid were changing the game by all the production and the writing that they were doing for a lot of artists. Around that time, Babyface and L.A. Reid were looking at cities actually to set up shop for LaFace Records. They were looking at Los Angeles. They even had Indianapolis on the map. But they chose the chocolate city of Atlanta, Georgia, where they set up shop. And they discovered a lot of artists from Tony Braxton, Raymond Usher, who was from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and came down to Atlanta, Georgia, teaming up with Organized Noise Production and discovering Outkast, Goody Mob, and so many influential acts that changed the game in the music industry. And this next clip, we have a discussion with Tommy Henderson, who's from Indianapolis, Indiana, and he's going to talk about his experience serving as the road manager for the deal, and how he ultimately landed and connected with Babyface and worked at LaFace Records.
The contribution of black music. So, Tommy, so you're from? Can you kind of talk about? You're from Indianapolis, right?
Yeah, from Indianapolis.
You kind of talk. Where'd you go to high school at?
Addicts.
Oh, you went to Addicts. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I grew up right by Addicts.
Oh yeah. I got my Starbucks from there this morning. Matter of fact, right over there. Yeah. Tommy, can you kind of talk about just your upbringing and how you discovered music and how you made that connection with Daryl and Kenny early on when you lived in Indianapolis?
Okay. Yeah. Music has always been, in my life. When I was a kid, I always danced, around my parents and stuff.
Yeah.
They had parties or whatever, and, would buzz in.
Yeah.
When I was little, James Brown influence, Beatles,
Right.
big influence. But James Brown, I think, would be really the first kind of like influence, and I would do James Brown dances and stuff, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
And then so, time went on a bit, but really loved the Beatles. I was, really big on the Beatles. But I think what really made everything just take off in my head was Jackson 5.
Oh yeah.
When the Jackson 5, came about.
Yeah.
I remember the song Big Boy.
Uh-huh.
The first single was Big Boy. Before they went to Motown.
Yeah.
And you heard on WTLC about this group out of Gary, Indiana.
Yep.
5 boys out of Gary, Indiana, brothers, the song called Big Boy.
Yeah.
And that was 1968.
Uh-huh.
And a year later, bam, Motown.
Okay.
And they came out, like a year later.
Yeah.
It happened that fast,
Yeah.
And I think that's where just really my biggest influence came from the Jackson 5.
Uh-huh.
Really.
Yeah.
But I played saxophone in a band with a friend of mine, Jimmy Miles.
Okay.
And Jimmy Miles, you might know Jimmy.
Jimmy Miles.
James Miles.
No way.
Wife is Portia Miles.
Get out of here! I know them.
Yeah.
Very well.
Yeah. Jimmy and I can't even remember the name of the group. Jimmy played guitar.
No
I was
way.
on saxophone. It was another guy, Richard, played saxophone. Tony Temple, a guy named Tony Temple, played drums. Raymond Shannon played guitar.
That's great. Cause Jay had a church I used to go to back in 1970 in a little church.
We go back. We probably met in probably 1969, 70.
Yeah.
And junior high.
Uh-huh.
At 17.
Yeah. How did you meet Kenny and Daryl?
Well, that happened, later on because I was dating a girl named Colette LaRue.
Uh-huh.
And she went to North Central.
Yep.
So that's how I met Daryl and Kenny, actually. I'd already heard about Kenny because, he was in that local Jackson 5 group called the Indy 5. And Jimmy was in it too.
Really?
Jimmy Miles. Jimmy Miles was in the Indy 5.
I'm gonna call him.
He was in the Indy 5.
Because I talked to his son, J3. I'm gonna call him.
Yeah.
But I never knew that.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
I mean, when I say we're close, I mean we're like super close.
Yeah.
I mean, like super close.
Yeah.
And but yeah, so that's how I met Kenny and Daryl. That was probably like 1974. But like I said, I always heard about Kenny because he was in the Indy 5.
Yeah.
And had never just really met him.
Yeah. When did so how did you end up being road manager for Manchild?
That was my mother is from West Virginia.
Yeah.
And ever since I was born, when I say ever since I was born, I mean like I was born in 1955.
Yeah.
Summer of 1956, I was in West Virginia.
Okay.
That was our summer vacation. going to West Virginia. And every year I was in West Virginia, and probably in 1975 or 76 in West Virginia, went to a club, whereas my cousin's boyfriend's father owned the club. Went to a club, and here comes the band. I said, I know those guys, which was Daryl, Kenny, Chucky Bush. And I was like, I know those guys. They're from Indianapolis. You know, I didn't know anybody else in the band. You know, anybody else in Manchild. And they're looking out in the audience. They see me. They're like, "What are you doing in Charleston, West Virginia?" You know. And then so, you know, when I got off stage, you know, we talked and stuff and whatever and everything. And that's when I met Sid. I met Sid there in West Virginia. Sid and I, we talked for a while. You know, quite a bit. And then we talked again when I returned to Indianapolis. You know, after, you know, a little vacation. And at the end of that conversation, he asked me if I wanted to come on as road manager of Manchild.
Oh, wow.
I was like, sure. You know.
So I'm sure like that relationship kind of blossomed other things that, you know, you did with them in their careers. How did you end up connecting with Kenny when he launched LaFace? Well,
we just always kept in contact through the years. You know, when he'd come to town, you know, we go out and get together or whatever. But it was always like, you know, whoever makes it or whatever, you reach back, you know, holler and see what you can do or whatever. And so. He flew me down to Atlanta, February of 1990.
Really? So you were still living in Indianapolis?
I was still in Indianapolis, So he flew me down just to hang out for the weekend. Flew me down. I came out and hung out for the weekend. He kept asking me to stay one more day. I kept calling back at work. I need another day. I need another day. I ended up staying a whole week.
Oh, wow.
At the end of that week, they were doing Whip Appeal. Auditions for Whip Appeal. So I was there for the Atlanta auditions for Whip Appeal. And then so at the end of that week, he asked me if I wanted to come back down and work for LaFace.
Wow.
And I thought about it for about a half a second. And I said, sure. And I'm going to tell you, I always tell people 3 great things happened that weekend. Mike Tyson lost for the very first time that Saturday night.
Was that the one in Japan?
Buster Douglas. Yeah. The next morning, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. The very next morning. Really? And then Kenny asked me to work for LaFace. I always say 3 great things happened that weekend. That's amazing. But yeah.
Did you know that? So, am I right about saying that Jermaine Jackson was the first artist on the label?
No, he wasn't the first. It was really Damian Dame was really the first release.
Okay.
Although they had actually signed Divine Stevens, which was Divine at 90 miles per hour at the time. I don't know if you're familiar with Divine or not. Divine Stevens, he's choreographer, producer.
Okay.
He's the one who put Akon on. You know, got Akon his deal. But Divine was actually the first act with LaFace. But Damian Dame actually released because nothing came out. Nothing came out with Divine at 90 miles per hour. Tommy,
what do you think? Why do you think LaFace Records and what Kenny and LA did in terms of music? Why do you think it was so significant to Black culture, that label?
Because them being Black and them actually choosing Atlanta as that Black Mecca, for it to happen. But when you come, you got to come correct. You got to come, you know, with some talent, and that's exactly what they did. You know, it was just amazing. You know what they came with.
That premier label.
You know, along with Tommy Henderson, there were so many key players who worked at LaFace that really made the label such a premier label. And one of those individuals was Dr. Sherry Riley, my good friend, who I met
almost close to 30 years ago when I was in high school. I met her when I wrote for the Indianapolis Record newspaper in a internship program, and that's where I first met and interviewed Outkast and Usher, and then later would have an internship at LaFace Records when I attended Morris Brown College. Dr. Riley was the senior director of marketing at LaFace Records, and she's going to kind of talk about her experience working with Usher and launching his career as well as Outkast. Did you guys? So here's my question. What was the team effort like in terms of LaFace launching his career? Because I know he spent like a year with Puffy, so it sounded like a lot of people had their hands in kind of launching his career. What was that like, just in terms of what you did?
Yeah, so when I started, he was already signed, and the song that was out was Call Me a Mac, that was on the Poetic Justice soundtrack. Yeah. And to be very honest, when I came on board, there was a lower interest in Usher as an artist. At that time, TLC had really broke through. Tony Braxton had really broke through. And LA had been recording music on Usher that just wasn't connecting. His voice was changing at that time. And, you had this swag that was very adult that Usher had, but he was this 15-year-old kid. And so it was like, there was just this huge gap of where does he fit? And because other artists were, taking off at the time when I got there, it was like he wasn't really in the mix as like a priority, even though LA knew he had a star. It was kind of like, what do we do with him? And he had just come back, or he was in between kind of this time he was spending with Puffy in New York, and, it's like there's something here. And so when I came on board, Usher and I really connected from the standpoint of I'm from Kentucky, he's from Tennessee. There's this Midwest work ethic mentality where I could just appreciate how hard he worked. Like, I mean, what you see now, he was doing when he was 14, 15. Right. And so I really gravitated to, he has a dream. Like, I had a dream to get to LaFace working in the industry. He has a dream of what he wants to achieve. And he was very clear for a young kid on articulating that dream. But I'll tell you, when I really, really knew there was something there is we would walk through the mall. And literally at that time, this is before cell phones and all those things. And it wasn't just the girls that would come up to him, the 13, 14, 15-year-old girls. You get the guys that were 13, 14, and, they swagged out and smooth. And they're like, I want to get your autograph for my girlfriend. I want to get your autograph for my sister. And then I'd see, 40-year-old women approaching him, and I'd have to be like, back up, man, back up. But I knew then, because when you have 14, 15-year-old boys, one asking for an autograph, when usually, ego won't let them do that. Yeah. And he was always so gracious in that space, but he also understood there was something about him that was just magnetic.
That's interesting. That's kind of like the similar story that JD shared with about Criss Cross, when they were just walking through Lenox Mall. Even when he met him at Greenbrier Mall, they already had like a little clique and people was following him. So it's funny you mentioned that. And then in terms of like, and this is my last question about Usher, like him, like that second album, wasn't JD involved in that album? Was it the second one, My Way?
My Way, yeah. So,
So what was that?
And JD, when it's the 25th anniversary right now of My Way. Yeah, that was just a magic that they created in that studio. And the hit song "You Make Me Wanna," like the album was done. And when LA got that record, like literally it was done. We were mastered, ready to go. And LA called me in his office and said, "Yo, I want you to hear this song." And at the end of it, I stood up to leave. And he was like, you didn't say anything. What do you think? And I was like, I got work to do. That meaning that's a smash. I got to go basically get this record added to the album, to the marketing. It was an absolute smash.
Yeah.
And, it just really, they still make great music together.
Oh, yeah, definitely. 17, 18. What was it like working their album, Southern Playlistic?
Man, that album was such a joy. And well, when I got there, Shanti Das, who really had led the charge on the promotion side, working Players Ball, that was a Christmas record, and it was on the Christmas album. And so the marketing for that started around that time. Well, it was 9 months before the record got any breakthrough. Like, nobody, it's unheard of now to work a record 9-10 months. But that record was worked in the streets. And, the thing about Dre and Big was they were so young, but they just had this maturity about them. Like, you have to remind yourself, like, these are teenagers, right? But they, that was fun. It was a lot of work, a lot of creativity. And I will say probably one of the greatest accomplishments of working them is at that time, it was New York and LA.
Yeah.
And you either was New York in the rap game or you was LA in the rap game. And, when Outkast and Big, when Outkast came out, people in New York and LA wouldn't admit that they listened to it. You know what I'm saying? Because the overall media message was, some of the pioneers in hip hop and rap was like, that ain't really rap. And so you have, the people in New York trying to dismissing it. And what I love is, we went to New York one day and literally every car that went by was listening to Outkast.
Wow.
And I was like, so it doesn't matter what the media is saying, because in these streets, in these New York streets, they listen to Outkast.
Yeah. And that's funny you said that, because I know Blue, their manager, was from New York, and he was kind of sharing like how that was kind of like, but they made it work. So I thought that was interesting. Talking about in the documentaries about a half hour is just the significance of what LA and Babyface did. Even like Daryl Simmons, I know he was kind of played the back, but he was definitely a major influence. But just like, what was your and you can kind of talk about this like together or just like personally, like individually, like what was your relationship and interaction with like how you worked and flowed with Babyface in LA when you were at LaFace?
Yeah, so LA was in Atlanta in the office, and Kenny was in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And so with LA, it was literally every day, all day in the music industry at the time. That's 24 hours a day. So it was meetings in the morning in his office, listening to music throughout the day. It was meetings at his house in the evening. It was taking he'd have music sessions where the music would come. He'd have us come by the house, listen to it. It was just this. It was always about the music. And it was always about the excellence with the music. Yep. And then when Kenny would come to town, he would, be in the office, or if we had retreats. And the dynamic with the two of them is, they always talked. Like they talked every day. When you go in LA's office, he'd be turned in his chair with his back to the door on the phone talking to Kenny. And, so LA was the one there every day. But Kenny and LA truly were LaFace. Like it was truly this dynamic duo as far as the creativity, the energy, the strategy, and just the music. Mm-hmm. Just the music. I working with the two of them that early in my career was a PhD in excellence in music and artistry. I learned so much about the power of excellence and hard work and just what it meant for the absolute best. When I started, I'll tell this about TLC real quickly. But before I started in August, and there was a conference that we all attended. They flew me in for the conference in Seattle, and I walked into LA's Penthouse, and the lights went off, and he played this TLC video. I hadn't started. My first day wasn't for like another month. Oh, wow. And the lights came up from watching the video, and he asked me, Sherry, what you think? Now, I was thrown away because I'm like, I haven't even started. Like, you're asking me an opinion, like, and I didn't like it. I didn't like the video.
Which one was it?
It was the second Creep video no one has ever seen. And but in that moment is when I really began to gain his respect, because I was honest and and was able to share with him what I really thought, and he was like, wow, okay, and he agreed. And what I learned instantly before I even started, he was like, you're right. Everyone in the room was in agreement. And he was like, we're going to scrap it and shoot another one. So literally, here's, a record executive who'd already, this is the second video. And he was like, it ain't up to par. It ain't up to par. It ain't, because they could have edited and tweaked it and made it really good. But it wasn't phenomenal. And he knew this album he had was phenomenal. And he shot a third video, which is the one we see that, with the pajamas that literally set the tone for this Diamond album that followed. But I learned quickly, you got to bring your A game at all times.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you this. So was you behind in launching Boris Kojo's career? He was at
Red Light Spectrum. Yeah, it was a dark night in New York. That video was shot at night in New York. And that darkness you see in that